YouTube, what's good? Welcome back to the channel. I'm fresh off watching Oppenheimer in 70mm IMAX, and I've got a lot of views now. This is actually my first 70mm IMAX movie ever, so I don't have too many things to go off of, but I think this movie is a pretty good case study. A couple things to make clear. I really enjoyed the movie. I really enjoyed the experience overall, so nothing but positive feelings here. But there are some key things I want to talk about that kind of go contrary to that experience. Second thing I want to point out is I'm no expert. I've never met Christopher Nolan. I don't know people on the inside. So everything I'm about to tell you here is based off of my experience and my opinion, but also based off of some research that I've done by reading a lot of articles online, reading a lot of first-hand information from Nolan, from the DP, Hoyt as well. I won't say the last name because I always screw it up. So there's a lot of information here, and if something's wrong, feel free to tell me in the comments. But just know that I tried my best here, and if you want to fight somebody, go fight somebody else. So there's one key thing we need to distinguish here before we continue with this video, and that is that this movie Oppenheimer was shot with 65mm film, but in two varieties. There's the 15 perforation variety and the 5 perforation variety. It's the same exact film stock, the same exact film base, but the cameras used and the lenses used potentially vary depending on which format you're going for. So for 15 perforation, which is the biggest possible image you can get, that's done with the Imax 70mm camera. That's that big box that you see on the screen here. This camera produces incredibly large negatives, and it's a very loud camera as well, which is why it wasn't used for the entirety of the movie. This is the thing though that you're paying for when you go see the movie in 70mm IMAX. This is the big attraction, and this is the thing that delivers that incredibly unique image, which we'll talk about a bit more later. As I said though, these cameras are a bit cumbersome because of the size, but also because of the sound. Check out this sample right here. That camera's really loud, and because of that, you can't really use it in every single possible scene in the movie. If you're up close to your characters and there's very important dialogue happening, that camera's gonna intrude, and the sound might be picked up by the mics you're using to record the dialogue of your scene. Therefore, for a lot of movies, specifically in this movie, let's say, another camera was used to shoot these dialogue scenes, and it is a 70mm/65mm camera, but it's not the IMAX camera. It's one of these super Panavision cameras, and this is what produces the 5 perf image. 5 perf is a third of the size of 15 perf image. You can compare the negatives right here. As you see, the 15 perf is more of almost like a square image. It's not a square, but it's just closer to that, just for estimation and for visual reference. Whereas the 5 perf image is much more of a long rectangle. So 3 of those 5 perf images make up a 15 perf image. This is a very important distinction to make because 70mm IMAX in the theaters is going to take up the entire full IMAX screen, which is again closer to a square just for estimation, but the 5 perf image does not fill in that entire screen natively. If you put both 5 perf and 15 perf on the same exact projection, there's going to be a very clear difference. So in this movie, they used both, and for the scenes where 5 perf was used to record the image, that image is then blown up to fit as much as possible into the 15 perf image size. So when you watch a print of Oppenheimer in the movie theater, you're seeing both formats, and if you're in a 70mm IMAX projection of it, when you're seeing the 15 perf, you're gonna get the entire screen full, and you're gonna have that giant image that sometimes you can't even see the whole screen all at once. But in the scenes that use 5 perf, that 5 perf image is being zoomed into. So you're gonna lose part of that image on the sides, but it's going to be zoomed into so that it fills the entire width of the IMAX screen, but it's not going to fill the entire vertical space. It theoretically could if they chose to do so, but in Oppenheimer, it doesn't do so. You still get a bit of space on the top and the bottom. Conversely, the opposite thing happens if you watch a 70mm print of this movie. Not IMAX, but just 70mm print. You're going to have the opposite effect, which means that for the scenes that have 15 perf IMAX footage, that's actually going to be cropped in order to fit into the 5 perf print that you're watching. So if you're watching a 70mm print, you're not gonna have that full giant square-ish kind of image that IMAX 70mm gives you. You're gonna remove the top and the bottom, and you're gonna be left with just the crop of the center part of that image. They can choose another part of it if they feel like, but I would say for the most part, you're probably getting more of the center of that image. To summarize all of that, the physical prints of 70mm IMAX film that you're seeing in the theater are not entirely comprised of images that are 15 perforation. It's going to be a mix of the 15 perf and the 5 perf. And I would say in this movie, it's about a 50-50 mix. I don't have hard numbers on this, and I wasn't able to find any anywhere. But from what I remember from watching the movie earlier today, I feel like it was actually a much more balanced mix between 15 and 5 perf. I was hoping it'd be a lot more 15 perf because that's the big attraction that I went to go see. But it was clear that a lot of the dialogue scenes in the movie were shot on 5 perf. And ultimately, I don't think this was a creative choice. I think this was due to practical limitations, again, because of the noise of the camera. It's a bit unfortunate, but it's a really interesting experience to see them switch between the two. But that's actually what we're going to dig into now. How does that affect the experience of watching the movie in 70mm IMAX? Well, actually, let's talk about the scenes that use 15 perf 65mm first. The resulting images are ginormous. They literally are huge because the IMAX screen is so big. And in a lot of these scenes, you might not even be able to see the bottom of the image depending on what seat you have in the theater. But nonetheless, the images are incredibly large and they're very pristine despite how big they are. They don't look digital. They're not super clinical and perfect, but they look super, super clean. When we talk about grain and sharpness, they look beautiful from that perspective. And of course, this is really good for landscape style images where you have huge views of a physical vista, such as a desert landscape like they do in this movie, or, you know, a really good view of kind of like a big set piece where you have a lot of moving pieces and things like that. All of that looks absolutely amazing. And that's one of the key reasons why you go see movies in IMAX, for that grandeur. The beauty about this movie is that they do a lot of close-up scenes with the IMAX camera as well. So you're getting full 15 perf on really intimate up-close scenes where there's not a lot of dialogue or where there's kind of a montage or a voiceover or something like that. And the resulting images are ridiculous, honestly. You're getting incredibly beautiful medium format style images. When I say medium format, I'm referring to still photography here. But you get images that look like that, except in motion picture. So imagine taking this camera right here. This is my Hasselblad 500C with the old Zeiss lens. Imagine taking that camera and shooting a movie with it, especially up close images. You're blowing that up onto this giant IMAX screen and the portraits look insane. So all of the scenes where they get up and close to the character, not only do you see all the detail and all the beautiful rendition of the film on the person's skin, because of the lighting, because of the makeup, because of the person's expression on their face, all of that looks amazing. But the best part is you're getting all of this background information as well. The lenses that are used on these 70mm film cameras have really big image circles, and therefore they're producing that unique medium format style look when you compare it to still photography. So that is incredible to see in the giant IMAX screen. Specifically, the black and white sections of this movie that were shot on the 15 perf film look stunning. There's literally nothing like it that has ever been done, because this is the first time that black and white film has been put through one of these modern IMAX cameras. So you're getting Kodak XX flowing through this IMAX camera, and you're getting all the beautiful qualities of it. Medium format on black and white old school movie film just looks absolutely amazing. And when I saw this for the first time in the movie, it just blew my mind. The images just look so perfect. Again, in a very natural way, not in like a very aggressively digital way. And the lighting and the costumes and everything came together really, really nicely for those 15 perf images. However, as I said before, this movie switches between 15 perf and 5 perf quite a bit. And to me, that's actually not that great of a thing when it comes to the visual experience. Unfortunately, the 5 perf images, when they're stretched out to fill in that big IMAX screen, I actually think they suffer quite a bit, especially the black and white images. So to remind you, the 5 perf images as part of the 70mm IMAX print, which is the 15 perf kind of standard, those 5 perf images are zoomed into, and therefore you lose a lot of the detail from the sides, and then also you're kind of pushing the film past its limits when it comes to image resolution. So you're going to see a lot more of the physical film characteristics. With the black and white film especially, the grain became so much more evident. And the problem here is that in and of itself, that's not a bad thing. But when you go back and forth between 15 and 5 perf, the difference becomes very, very obvious. So like I said, the grain becomes very, very visible in the 5 perf images, and it's kind of distracting, especially when you have an immediate kind of side by side, like a scene begins on a 15 perf image and then instantly switches to 5 perf, and it just looks very different, and the grain becomes noticeable, and then the contrast also becomes quite noticeable. It was actually very surprising to me in a couple scenes where it looked as if the images had completely different color grades. And there were no color grades involved here because this is printed directly from a negative. It was just a manipulation of the film printer. But it appears, if you compare it to digital, let's say, it would appear as if there was a completely different color grade on one image versus the other. And that is a direct result of the 15 perf versus the 5 perf. So that experience became kind of weird for me as the course of the movie went on. I'm curious how many people actually noticed this and felt something about it, because, you know, it ranges in terms of who sees the movie. But I was paying a lot of attention to the film aspect of it because that's something that I really care about. And that's part of the reason I went to go see it in 70mm IMAX, because it was a film projection. But the manifestation of those differences took a little bit away from the experience. This was less of an issue with the color scenes because Vision 3 film is what was used for the color scenes, and Kodak Vision 3 is a very modern emulsion. Let's say it's like 15 years old or something like that, maybe a little older, maybe 20 years. Either way, it's way more modern than Kodak XX, which is the black and white film that was used. Kodak XX is a much older film emulsion, and it's really cool because of the fact that it's old, and that's why a lot of people love using it. But when you compare a 5 perf to a 15 perf image and you zoom into that 5 perf image, it brings out some of the imperfections of the Kodak XX film. And I say imperfection, that might be kind of a harsh way to describe it, but again, I think it's the contrast when you put the two together. That's where you notice the difference, and maybe that's why it bothers me a little bit. But if this whole movie was just shot on 70mm 5 perf, I probably would have thought it was amazing and beautiful visually. So I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I'm curious what you think. Let me know in the comments. Another thing we're talking about here is focus. And when I mean focus here, I'm talking about the actual mechanism of changing the focus of your lens to produce whatever image you're looking to produce. On the good side of that, it kind of touches on what I mentioned before. Those scenes where you have the 15 perf images, especially when they're shot wide open on the lens, the images are amazing. And the razor thin focus just creates a look that is very hard to replicate in any other way. If you have smaller film formats, you could use lenses that are super wide open, let's say in the 1.4 aperture range kind of thing. Maybe that'll give you an equivalent look, but again, the image and the field of view is going to vary, and it's not going to be the exact same thing as when you shoot on those larger formats. So that unique look you get from shooting these medium format lenses wide open is amazing to see here in a motion picture setting. And the focus becomes part of the visual appeal of this movie, especially again, when you got that giant IMAX screen, which is 80 feet or something like that. It's just really amazing to see. The downside of the kind of the focus aspect of this film is that pulling focus on a film format that big, especially when you're shooting wide open, becomes very, very difficult. The depth of field gets razor thin when you're shooting wide open. So when you focus on someone's eye, potentially their nose is going to be out of focus. And, you know, this can play into the storyline. This can be used in creative ways. But I actually noticed that in a lot of the film, there were random scenes of out of focus images. And not out of focus intentionally, where it was a creative choice and it lends something to the storytelling. Just straight up out of focus. I'm curious if any of you noticed that as well, because the movie was really well focused in so many scenes, but then randomly you would watch a dialogue scene and the same character in the scene, every time they spoke, they'd be out of focus, especially when they were the only person in the shot. That was really confusing to me, and I'm really shocked that that actually made the film, because I assume that typically in movies these things are noticed and picked up and then they reshoot if the focus puller, for example, makes an error. However, I did read in one of the articles a direct quote from Hoyt that a lot of these shots were shot and there were no reshoots depending on kind of what was going on. So I would assume maybe they saw these things, after they saw the dailies, which would probably take a couple days given that they all shot it on film. And once they saw it, perhaps they already moved on, and therefore we're like, you know what, we're not going back, we're just going to keep it as is. It didn't hurt the story. The story flowed very, very well. But visually, again, these are certain things that I just kind of saw over and over again, and it was weird to experience. There was a lot of imperfection in the creation of the image. And sometimes it was a nice thing, and sometimes it wasn't a nice thing. So I was very surprised by that. I really hope I don't sound like I'm nitpicking here, but the problem is when you have this giant IMAX screen, a lot of these things become way more noticeable as compared to when you watch things on your phone, on a TV at home, or even on a regular movie screen. I just couldn't help but notice the out of focus scenes. It just didn't lend anything good to the scene, and it definitely didn't seem like a creative choice to me. I think as a whole, what I'm trying to say here is that 70mm IMAX is not perfect. It's actually very imperfect, and that's part of the charm. It takes a lot of work to shoot these different film formats, to physically splice them together, as was done for this movie, and then to create positive prints from negatives. There's a lot of analog steps that went into the 70mm film IMAX process for this movie specifically, and therefore, you know, a lot of kudos out to Nolan and his whole team, because this was a very, very difficult thing to do as compared to shooting it all in digital and just doing a completely digital process. So IMAX is very imperfect, and that's part of the charm, and that's part of what we like about the fact that this was used for this movie. There are some other imperfect things that are interesting to notice. One is the dust. My projection was pretty flawless. There wasn't anything physically wrong with the projection itself and the sound and all that, but there was dust on the screen throughout the whole movie. It wasn't the same speck of dust the whole time, but different specks of dust would pop up and they'd stay on the screen, let's say for like 10 seconds sometimes. It's not like those fake film mats that you can buy to put on digital footage where the dust kind of goes in and out very quickly. Here it was like one big speck of dust would be on a character's face for 5 to 10 seconds, and you can't help but stare at it and wait for it to go away. Or at least I felt like I couldn't. And again, maybe people experienced it very differently, but in some scenes, especially portrait scenes where a person's face is a central thing, you'd have this big speck of dust right on their face, on their skin. And it was a pretty big distraction, but that's what happens when you watch a 70mm projection. It's a real process, and there's a real roll of film rolling through that machine. So anything that goes in there is going to affect the image. And it's charming to some degree, but it could be real distracting as well. I'm very fortunate that my film projection went basically flawless, like I said, but I've heard stories, and a lot of these things were published online, of projectors breaking. So people watching the movie, mid-movie randomly, things would go down. And that would be a very terrible thing to experience. I'm happy that I didn't have to do that, because I don't have anything good to say there. If that happened to me, I'd be pretty pissed off. But nonetheless, the IMAX experience and knowing that there's a projectionist up in that booth, ensuring that the film is running through that machine properly. There's something very romantic about that. It's something very cool. In this digital age where everything is done with computers, it's cool to see some things being done manually with analog machines. So I love that I went to go see it as a film projection, 70mm IMAX. The huge screen was a huge plus, and even though the image changed from 15 to 5, the image was still giant, and it looked pretty cool. And just knowing that this was all being done via an analog process definitely made it feel cooler as well. I'm a film nerd just like a lot of you watching this video, and so I appreciate that a lot. So for those of you who saw this movie in 70mm IMAX, let me know, what do you think about the experience? Do you agree with some of the things I'm saying? Do you disagree with some of the things I'm saying? I'm really curious, because even though I really liked the whole experience, you know, I'm being a little bit nitpicky here because I was surprised by certain things. But nonetheless, it's a 2 thumbs up for me. So if you're considering to go see it in 70mm IMAX, if you can somehow get tickets still, definitely try to get them, because it's worth it. All right, y'all, that's the video for today. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. And of course, hit me in the comments. Let me hear what you got to say. All right, y'all, to the next one. I'm out.